Can I give the call to the member for Goldstein?
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, it's wonderful to speak on this legislation following the former Deputy Chair of the Economics Committee in the House of Representatives. I suspect he was sacked from that job by his Labor colleagues on the basis that he wasn't prepared to stand up to the chair in the last term of parliament successfully, as we drew attention to the dishonesty and the misinformation that was promoted by the Labor Party regarding their campaign to whack a massive, great, big new tax on Australian retirees. And when you understand, this is a particularly sore point, Deputy Speaker, in the context, because this does come back down to financial regulation and financial security, which APRA oversights. Before the last election, we had the Labor Party going out and smearing, myself and others, Australian retirees, who dared to stand up and say if a Labor government were elected, people would lose a third of their income overnight if you were an Australian retiree, self-funded retiree. And they said that was misinformation, and honesty goes to the heart of the confidence you can have in the retirement security system. They said that was misinformation, it wasn't true, that people were exempt and would never own up to the truth until they lost the election, in part because of that very issue, and have now had to concede first that they're not going to prosecute, or they claim they're not going to prosecute that agenda again, but they've given themselves wiggle room. Don't misunderstand, Deputy Speaker. They want to come after and do a hit job on Australian retiree security again. But you even then had the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, or the now Leader of the Opposition, after the election, conceding that actually they were going to hit some people who are on low incomes. And in fact, what we said in the Economics Committee at the time was right, that the consequence of a Labor government was going to be to push Australian retirees beneath the poverty line, a disgraceful action that needs to be exposed and called out. Because there's nothing worse than centralised authority taking from Australians their hard-earned living, their own security, on a dishonest misinformation campaign to try and suggest that somehow they were the benefactors of public largesse. And that's what this piece of legislation ultimately goes to. Yes, it's a rudimentary piece of administrative legislation around who pays what to manage and operate our financial regulators, notably APRA. But it's about what capacity they then have to do their job to make sure we have security at the heart, and trust and honesty at the heart of our financial services system. And as members in this place will know, in the last term of parliament, the then Treasurer, now Prime Minister, commissioned the Economics Committee to have regular oversight of the four major banks. And under the stewardship of the two previous chairs, as well as myself, we held regular hearings into the four major banks to reveal and uncover misconduct and questionable practice to make sure that they are properly held to account as part of a stable financial system. We had a Royal Commission organised by the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, which revealed further misconduct and questionable practices across the board. And as a consequence, the Economics Committee in this term of parliament has been given a term-long inquiry to oversight the ongoing implementation and, of course, to continue to question the financial services sector about their conduct and make sure that trust, security and confidence can be at its heart. And, Deputy Speaker, we have already done so and will continue to do so. Nearly 1 year into this inquiry, we have already revealed industry funds deliberately reactivating accounts and transferring money between themselves and into their group Oz Fund so that they can harvest the hard-working savings of Australians, to reactivate their accounts, to harvest them for insurance and fees. And because of the work of the Economics Committee, the Parliament has now taken action to shut down that practice for industry super to harvest low balance inactive accounts. And of course, we've continued to look at the misconduct in other sectors. We returned to the very banks and have looked specifically at some of the challenges we've faced around ME Bank, a wholly owned subsidiary of industry super funds that for 5 months had been conspiring to close down the account options of the people who were entrusted, whose money they were entrusted to hold, by closing down their redraw facilities. For 5 months, they knew they wanted to do this, and contestably longer. And never once did it enter their minds to turn around and say to those Australians who entrusted their money with ME Bank that they should tell them that they're going to shut down their options. For a not-for-profit bank that's supposed to be there to help its customers, you've got to question where their priorities sit. Worse, they told ASIC, the regulator, about the plan, and ASIC said, if you go down this path, you have an obligation to tell customers that you are going to shut down their options and design a strategy. Now, to be fair to ME Bank, they did have a strategy. It was to impose silence and implement communications after they had shut down those options. This is the misconduct that we continue to pursue through the Economics Committee, to make sure that there's proper accountability, working with APRA and ASIC's work to make sure that there's accountability in our financial services system. But there is a long way to go, Deputy Speaker, and trust me, I can assure you there is a long way to go. Because what we continue to unveil, well, whether it is the deliberate intention of transferring money through low balance inactive accounts to harvest for unnecessary fees and insurance industry supers fees for no service moment, or of course the misconduct of ME Bank, that they then misled the Parliament and the committee until the regulator exposed their dishonesty, raises broader questions about the conduct of some sectors that have gotten a free ride. We haven't just looked at super. We've raised difficult and challenging questions of the banks, the major banks. The Economics Committee, in fact myself as chair, was the first person to ask Westpac about their issues with AUSTRAC, which later led to the downfall of Brian Hartzer. We've spoken to the small banks, particularly around some of the challenges they're facing, but also making sure that both they and the major banks are doing the right thing by small businesses and making sure they're passing through the cost benefits of low-cost routing. And that isn't over either yet, Deputy Speaker. In fact, in the lead-up to the next hearing of the Reserve Bank of Australia and their payment systems, I want to make sure that it's clear that we expect banks to be able to pass on to small businesses lower-cost options rather than only being provided to larger institutions and larger customers. And yes, we've looked at retail super. And one of the first actions we took at the end of the last round of hearings late last year was to give on notice for one of the largest retail super funds, AMP, that they would be recalled and there'd be an expectation they would continue to answer questions over past conduct, but also into the future. Recently, we had the insurance sector before us, and we've continued to provide questions on notice to them as well about making sure they're passing through any cost savings to Australians with insurance products who don't need extra costs associated with risk, consequently from the COVID-19 pandemic. If you can't drive your car to work, why does the cost of your car insurance stay the same? If you're a small business that can't open your door, then why are you paying the full cost of public liability insurance or other types of insurance from having customers? Those costs should be passed on. If you've got a travel insurance product and you can't go overseas, then you should get a full refund during this pandemic period. And while there are some people who go around deliberately slurring the work of the committee, saying we're focusing singularly, I can assure you with the Labor members, and even though I don't always agree with their line of questioning, we give full ambit to make sure that we challenge every part of our financial services system so it's acting in the best interest of the Australian consumer. Unapologetically. And our expectation is that APRA and ASIC does the same. Now, I will say, Deputy Speaker, I actually have some concerns around the practical operation of this bill. Because while it's a good thing that the burden and responsibility around covering the costs of APRA is shared, one of the biggest concerns I have out of the Royal Commission is the broad capture that occurs between financial institutions and the regulators. And we should never allow a situation where the heavy burden of the cost of running the regulator falls onto too few hands and shoulders. Because when it does, it raises questions about whether they're prepared to take the full extent of their powers against those ultimately who are compelled to feed them. So while I'll support this piece of legislation, make it clear we are watching you, APRA, we are watching you, ASIC, to make sure that you are doing your job. You are entrusted on behalf of the people of Australia and this parliament to hold our financial institutions to account, and let me make it clear, all financial institutions. It's not just about pursuing the easy wins that appear in the newspapers from time to time, where you can take legal cases to represent activity and responsiveness. The expectation is where there is misconduct, it will be revealed. Where institutions mismanage, that you will pursue them. And it goes across the whole structure of the financial services system. And I draw back to the example I used just before, Deputy Speaker, of ME Bank. If you look at some of their questions on notice that I have submitted as chair and then the answers they have provided, it's increasingly clear to me that there are questionable financial practices that are existing within that institution. And I will have more to say about that into the future. And that underlies the valuations and the assets of funds and the retirement security that Australians have, that leads to the financial stability of the nation. And APRA, you have a job to do in making sure that those valuations are credible. You have a responsibility to make sure that when reports are audited, that they're factual, that they're evidence-based and they're credible, that they're comparable to other financial institutions, and that nobody is cooking the books. And anybody who thinks that simply asking questions on these important matters is an inappropriate use of this parliament's time or the committee's time, Deputy Speaker, is delusional, because it is when you turn a blind eye to the conduct that we are supposed to be inquiring, that is where misconduct festers. It is not in light, it is in darkness. And it's what people think that they can get away with. And we saw that at the last election. Labor thought they could get away with removing up to a third of the income of Australian retirees. And the Economics Committee provided a platform for Australian retirees to stand up and speak out, and to highlight the misinformation and how people who had sacrificed their whole lives, who were living on marginal incomes, were going to be pushed below the poverty line, where families had set up small pools of shares to support loved ones into the future were going to be robbed. And where Australian retirees thought they could turn to security, it would have been denied. And it exposed a difficult truth. And regulators have the job to expose difficult truths too. to tell the truth and to bring light to dark places. And in passing this legislation, we should expect APRA to stand up and step up.